Hello, welcome to another episode of Out Loud. I am your host, Anthony Parker. Now, having been through the COVID-19 pandemic that is still rearing its head, we are now facing another outbreak, and this time with monkeypox, which has been declared a national health emergency by the Biden administration and a global health emergency by the World Health Organization as infections rise. And as of now, this virus seems to be impacting the LGBT community, and more specifically, men who have sex with men. Our guest today is here to break down the history of monkeypox, what this virus looks like when infected, prevention, and most importantly, vaccines. Please join me in welcoming Nurse Matt Murphy. Welcome. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to do my part in spreading awareness on this topic. Thank you.
I was first connected to Nurse Matt through the Loft LGBT Center, which is located in White Plains, and we've also been on the show before from an article he wrote for their Outspoken magazine called Monkeypox, What You Need to Know. And it's really a great resource and breakdown on the current situation the community is facing. So I definitely suggest everyone go visit the Loft's website, which is loftgaycenter.org, and check out this article. Now, Nurse Matt, there are some viewers out there who are maybe just seeing headlines about monkeypox, but then there are community members who are being infected or know people who are being infected. So to start, very, very basic, what is monkeypox?
Yeah, so monkeypox, it is a virus, and as you mentioned previously, it has risen to the level of being a global emergency. So it is something we want to take seriously. It's not something we want to create any hysteria over, or it's not something we really want to feel like we're reverting back to all those fears that we experienced during the COVID pandemic. But monkeypox, again, it is a virus. It's in the same kind of bucket as smallpox. So sometimes you might hear, especially when they're talking about vaccines, you might kind of hear that term thrown in there as well. Thankfully, monkeypox compared to smallpox is not as intense, not as severe, it appears, in terms of the symptoms we've been seeing as of late. Monkeypox was originally discovered back in about 1958, I believe. It was originally found in monkeys, ergo the name monkeypox. It wasn't seen in humans until about 1970, and primarily since then, it's been seen in Central and Western Africa. There have been kind of other locations where that monkeypox has shown up, but it seems to be mostly related to animals that have been transported across international borders that have become infected themselves or potentially infected other individuals.
How is monkeypox contracted and passed along amongst humans?
So monkeypox is really transmitted primarily through close personal contact. You might see the term out there in some of the literature on some of the websites that refer intimate contact. It also can be transmitted through respiratory secretions. There's some new evidence that it may potentially be associated with some forms of bodily fluids, but that really hasn't been researched well enough yet to, I believe, come to any firm conclusions on that. But it's really coming from that close personal contact and those respiratory secretions that could be transmitted from one individual to another, which you would imagine that if you are experiencing close personal contact with someone else, that you could potentially become in contact with their respiratory secretions.
Now, what do symptoms look like if infected?
So generally speaking, and in no specific order of onset, the individual will experience some flu-like symptoms. When we talk about flu-like symptoms, we're really talking about fatigue, muscle aches, fever, chills, maybe some swollen lymph nodes or swollen glands you might have heard it referred to as previously. Much like you would see with a lot of other viral illnesses, these other illnesses like the flu virus can precipitate similar symptoms. But again, those flu-like symptoms, again, they don't really come in any specific order, and they're really specific to the individual. So whereas you and I might experience flu-like symptoms, we might experience them differently. So it's kind of hard to put a really firm set of timeline symptoms associated with that inside that kind of flu-like symptom bucket. Eventually, the symptoms may progress to the rash that many of us have seen pictures of, or many of us have heard of inside some of the information that is out there, and some good informational signs and symptoms pictures related to those can be found on, for example, the CDC website or the Department of Health website. That rash can kind of develop as like a pimple or like a raised pimple. It can progress to more of what some people might refer to as like a boil. These lesions on the skin will eventually become fluid filled, and then eventually crust over, and then kind of as the illness progresses and as you recover from that illness, will fall off, so to speak. The rash tends to start on the extremities and maybe the head and face, and then move to the core. But again, these symptoms are really individualized. So not every person is going to experience these symptoms in the same kind of order or with the same intensity. There have been cases where people have gotten just the rash and really either didn't notice that they had flu-like symptoms or just didn't experience those flu-like symptoms at all. Where some people might get some very intense flu-like symptoms, and maybe they come out the other end of it with a much less significant rash component of these signs and symptoms that are associated with monkeypox.
Now, how long after a possible exposure does it take for symptoms usually to appear?
So when you're exposed or when you come in contact with monkeypox, that starts what we sometimes refer to as the incubation period, where that virus is in your body, kind of revving its ugly, engine, so to speak, and kind of revving up to precipitate the symptoms that you will later experience. Some people can be asymptomatic or can be inside of that incubation period for upwards of like 2 to 3 weeks, unfortunately. When those symptoms do start to precipitate, or when those symptoms do start to show, from the onset of symptoms, we're looking at about 2 to 4 weeks till most people resolve from that. That incubation period is kind of under investigation now too. Some medical experts out there are really looking into, can monkeypox be contagious or transmitted to another individual if that original person is asymptomatic. We think a lot, at least I think back to the COVID time, right? So when COVID came out, we didn't really know a lot about it. There were a lot of unknowns about COVID. We were really using a high index of suspicion initially, at least in the medical field, with how it's transmitted, who would be at risk, essentially how it gets from point A to point B. And there were so many unknowns for a long period of time. And now we're getting a lot more information related to COVID and how it was transmitted. There's also been multiple variants of COVID too, which has kind of muddied the waters a little bit. I guess the good thing about smallpox and monkeypox, even though I mentioned there's a lot of research ongoing, is that we have a good history on both of these viruses. So we have a good understanding, at least a firm foundation, as to how those viruses are transmitted from one individual to another, which helps us really design our practices in terms of prevention and mitigation of those symptoms.
If you fear you have monkeypox, maybe you're experiencing some symptoms or have a rash or a boil or a pimple, what should you do? Because there are no monkeypox tests out there.
Yeah, well, there are developed some certain swabs that can go to the lab and kind of evaluate potentially what that illness symptom might be. And in medicine, often, sometimes too, we're kind of ruling out certain things to kind of rule in what we think it might be. That's really specific to the institution or medical provider that you're in contact with. But really, the name of the game, or the real take home here, is just to know your facts and utilize a high index of caution and maybe suspicion in certain cases, that really the best medicine is prevention. Like a lot of things inside healthcare, injury prevention, preventative medicine, right? If we're starting kind of ahead of the game and we're using, good cautious life practices, and we're maintaining a certain sense of awareness about what's going on with a particular illness like monkeypox, and it really helps us kind of stabilize the illness as a whole, right? Because as a community or as a nation or as a world, if you want to think about it, right, it's kind of each individual's role and responsibility inside of that to do their best we can to kind of stabilize the spread of that illness. So it really comes down to preventative practices and how we might be able to allow ourselves to abstain from certain activities, or at least use caution inside those certain activities, that we are doing the best we can to keep ourselves safe. I mentioned before that the transmission is very often through close personal contact or intimate contact, right? So I don't want the message out there to be that we have to revert back to isolation and we have to revert back to, being scared to go out or being scared to talk to people or see people, right? We just got to be smart about it. I remember when COVID first started with my colleagues and I inside the medical field. I had friends and colleagues inside the industry that would become infected with COVID, and they'd go home and they'd isolate. They would stay away from their friends and family for long periods of time. I mean, you had people in the same house that didn't see each other for weeks on end, right? There'd be like, inside the house, DoorDash practices where you're dropping food off at your mom's, bedroom door because you wanted to be that careful in terms of eliminating any potential risk. And thankfully, where we are now with monkeypox, we're not really in that extreme emergent state, right? We just got to be smart about it. We just got to make sure that we're using good practices and isolating ourselves from risky situations. And it also doesn't mean that we can't be intimate with our partners. We just have to be smart about it. We have to make sure that we are maintaining an open line of communication, that if I inside my relationship are feeling ill, then I need to communicate that to my partner, look back on what symptoms I'm experiencing, the timeline, use some caution and as we proceed, and maybe consider things like vaccination or how we might kind of manage those symptoms until we have a better idea of what's going on.
Now, sort of talking about isolation, it sounds like if you do become infected, isolation obviously is key. So what or how long would isolation typically take?
So it kind of depends on the individual. It's really hard because the individualized symptoms may kind of really differ across a range of number of days or weeks, if you will. Kind of a general rule inside viral illnesses is that we kind of want to maintain a high index of caution or isolation while we're still experiencing symptoms. My symptoms might resolve in 2 weeks and I might be good to go and I might have no more rash and no more flu-like symptoms, and it could be okay for me to go back to work or see my family members or be intimate with my partner, but someone else might experience much longer symptoms. So it's really, we probably want to think less based on a certain amount of time and more so based on what those symptoms look like for that individual. If the symptoms have resolved and everything's back to normal, then you're probably good to go. If you're still experiencing any of those flu-like symptoms or that rash, then you probably want to extend your period of isolation or cautious practices a little longer.
Now, I've heard of this isolation period, and it's sort of taking a psychological toll on some people because can be quite lengthy.
Yeah, there's nothing fun about isolating, right? We came off, almost 2 years worth of isolation for certain people, and we're kind of, I mentioned in the article I'd written that this is kind of coming on the heels of COVID, and it's almost like we were afraid to kind of revert back to that isolation, to the changes in our lifestyle after we finally feel like we may have gotten back to normal. We're finally able to go to concerts now. We're finally able to engage in public events now. We're without a fear, and then all of a sudden monkeypox comes along and we got to start thinking about this all again. But again, like I mentioned before, we know so much more about monkeypox than we did when COVID first hit, that we're really in a much better place. And we really need to make sure that we're being careful not to kind of allow this to overwhelm ourselves. We got to be careful, but we can't let life come to a halt again. We just need to be cautious about what we're doing.
Sure. Now, there are things swirling around on the internet calling this a gay disease and stuff because this is primarily infecting gay men right now, it seems. What is your response to that? And maybe if you can give a little more insight on why this is impacting the gay community specifically right now.
Yeah, that message is definitely in part in some form or fashion out there, unfortunately. And I'll be honest, as a gay man, it does sting a bit. So I will say that I feel like the medical community, the medical experts out there are doing a pretty good job to mitigate that message from kind of getting out of control. It's a little bit of a slippery slope when you start identifying populations that are at higher risk or populations that are making up a greater percentage of those infected compared to others. And it's not easy, or I'm sorry, I apologize. It is easy for that kind of slippery slope to get away from us. But the reality is that, yes, at the present time, a large percentage of the people making up those infected happen to be members of the MSM community, right? So, but what is that possibly related to? Is that possibly related to a reporting structure? That could be related to a lot more things. And nothing about monkeypox is so specific to things like sex, for example, where men having sex with men are at magically some sort of higher risk, right? No, it's like any sex is close personal contact, and anyone having sex is having intimate contact with another person, right? So there's nothing specific about men having sex with men that makes them at higher risk, per se related to monkeypox, because all sex has a certain amount of risk associated with it. Just so happens, again, at the present time, that there is a larger percentage and that this community is being hit harder than others. And it's really, honestly, pretty early, in my opinion, in the evolution of this whole thing to really nail down any specifics in terms of high-risk populations long-term and what has influenced that. But it's a notable kind of revelation that there is a high risk inside this community at the present time. So then what do we do with that? We use that information and we focus more education, we focus more things like vaccine clinics in that direction so we can support that community, through that. History has kind of told us that at times, when you have a certain population that is found to be high risk for a certain thing, that things can go kind of sideways. And when that kind of negative information or that negative connotation kind of gets out there, that's not really facts-based, it's kind of a recipe, for certain feelings and certain bias, influences to kind of rear their ugly heads inside of that. So we're working with the information we have now. We're working with the information and we're using that to focus our efforts in terms of mitigation and prevention and even treatment in some cases.
Yes, so now we're going to get to vaccines, but before we get there, I want to sort of talk a little bit about treatments. Now, there's no widely available treatment out there as far as I know. I believe there's something that's sort of more experimental and only really used, I believe, in really severe cases, but there are pain management options. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no magic pill for monkeypox at the moment. And as a virus, viruses are managed differently than a bacterial infection, for example, right? If you have an infection, you get prescribed a certain antibiotic that has been known to treat that infection effectively, and then you go about your business taking that medication as directed, right? But unfortunately, there is really no magic pill, again, for monkeypox. There are antiviral medications out there, but the use of them and the administration of them is really heavily dependent at times on the course of illness, where you are inside that course of illness. Some antiviral medications have some pretty undesirable side effects associated with them. So it's not treating the monkeypox in the present state isn't really the focus. What is the focus inside of treating monkeypox is really managing those symptoms and managing the illness. For example, pain, like you mentioned, there is a strong element of pain, unfortunately, associated with the monkeypox rash, but inside of that, we can do things to manage that pain. There are certain medications, there are certain topical treatments that can be used to effectively or hopefully effectively manage that. And unfortunately, kind of by the nature of a viral illness, you got to let that illness run its course. So inside of that course of illness, or while it's working its way through your system and while your body is developing an immune response to it, we treat the symptoms and we really try to keep people as comfortable as possible. And much like the symptoms are different in every individual, the treatment of those symptoms are often individualized, where one thing might be very effective for myself and less effective for someone else. Pain management is kind of a tricky thing in itself too, especially when you go to certain providers who may be supportive of certain methods versus other methods in terms of managing the pain. But that would be a conversation you could have with your primary care physician, your medical doctor, whoever ends up treating you at any point during a monkeypox syndrome.
Sure. Now, again, before we kind of get into vaccines as a form of prevention, we talked a little bit about prevention, just being very cautious in that if you're experiencing some sort of symptoms, communicating that to people that you may be in close contact with. But if you could just lay down and sort of in bullet points, what are the best practices for prevention?
Yeah, best practices. If you have, first and foremost, if you have any type of symptom that you even might be suspicious of being associated with monkeypox, then you're going to want to stay home. You're going to, until you have seen a medical professional and have identified that as potentially being monkeypox or ruled monkeypox out, or by ruling something else in, or being determined to be something else, you want to stay home, respectful of your peers that you would be engaging in or engaging in whatever activities with, and just kind of stay home, relax, lay low until you have more information on that illness. When it comes to limiting close personal contact, right, it's not, not to make it sound oversimplified, but it's really kind of not rocket science, right? If you're out at an event and there's bare skin exposed, do the best you can that you're not coming in contact with anyone else's bare skin. If you are engaging in sexual activities, you want to be cognizant of those individuals that you are engaging with. Perhaps to have a conversation with them, make sure that they are aware of the risk and make sure they're aware of signs and symptoms so that they could potentially identify something in their own medical history or in their own recent past that could have put them at risk. There are a lot of kind of unique ways, I guess, nowadays, right, where we've got smartphones, we've got all sorts of visual media, available to us that, not to revert back to sex constantly inside this conversation, but if you have a partner and you're not able to be intimate, then you could use some sort of virtual medium, perhaps to use a virtual way of being intimate with them, just to get you through that period of time where the risk is, most evident, and you allow that process or even potential process to kind of run its course. Again, you want to use caution if you're even suspicious of, if you've had an exposure, until you really know that you're in the clear, out of respect for yourself and who you are engaging with.
Now, it also really sounds like COVID-19 pandemic has really sort of prepared us in a way to help, or just given us the knowledge to really be prepared to prevent these sort of things. Because, pre-COVID, people would go to work sick if they have a cold and stuff like that. So now we live in a world where if you're experiencing any sort of symptom that would be similar, you're a lot more, you notice it a lot more, and your senses are more heightened to that.
I mean, you can't even ride the train today and sneeze without getting the evil eye from someone on the train, right? So, but, I don't want to say rightfully so, but in a way, like, it's kind of good that people are maintaining a high index of suspicion. We were through a really tough couple years, and now we got, another little bump in the road that we're dealing with. And again, not to downplay it, but we have a lot more information available to us. We just got to make sure we're using that information intelligently and making sure we're keeping ourselves safe and the people we care about around us, informing them and keeping them safe as well.
Sure. So now, talking about this vaccine, tell us more about it and how it works.
So there's two vaccines really available to us here in the United States. There's one, the Jynneos vaccine, starts with a J, is definitely being used more often. With many vaccines, especially coming out of the pandemic, we were familiar with, the risk of shortages and the supply of these resources, right? So there is a overall caution, or at least appreciation, for the shortage or potential shortage of certain vaccinations. The vaccine is identified for certain individuals of certain high-risk populations who would be most appropriate for receiving that. So that includes people who have had a known exposure, people who have had a potential exposure, people who are members of those communities that have been identified as high risk already. So there is some criteria that comes along with who should be getting the vaccine. The vaccines are, a wonderful resource we have to us in modern day medicine, right? So they should definitely be used appropriately and intelligently. If people, it's a personal decision to get vaccinated, right? So vaccines are a great resource, but it is, again, a personal decision. And in making that decision, I just really encourage people to know everything they can as much as possible about those vaccinations. So the primary vaccine, for example, being given is a 2-dose vaccine. You want to speak with those individuals that are giving you that vaccination so that you know when to return for that second dose. It's not like a one and done type scenario, right? So it's not one shot and you're good to go. You need to receive that second dose. And even in that, there's a time period until you're considered fully immune or fully vaccinated against, in this case, smallpox. So you want to make sure that you're following those indications most appropriately, so that you took one step to be safe. Now you really got to follow it through. You got to make sure that you're using the vaccine resource most appropriately and keeping yourself safe while your immunity is building in response to that.
Exactly. And it's again, sounds like the COVID-19 vaccine in a sense. And I feel like this pandemic has really sort of made people a lot more aware of vaccines and everything because, of course, we're all vaccinated as children usually and things like that. But I didn't, you don't think about vaccinations really and what the process is. And there was so much hesitancy with the COVID-19 vaccine that now we are more prepared and know what the process looks like and everything, so that we can be more prepared for situations like this.
Yeah, thankfully, the vaccine we're using for monkeypox is the same one they were using to treat smallpox. So it's been around a while, right? So it's proven its worth. There's really good outcomes related to that vaccine, and there's been a lot of success in managing the vaccine we have offered to us. And vaccines, this vaccine doesn't need to only be given pre-exposure. It can be given to you post-exposure as well. They recommend sooner than 4 days post-exposure, on upwards of 14 days if needed. But if you have an exposure and you can get the vaccine within 4 days, you're going to really be setting yourself up for success and kind of working your way through those symptoms. And vaccines don't completely negate your ability or negate the potential for you to get whatever virus we're talking about, right? It's a protective measure. So nothing's a guarantee in life, unfortunately. But you're setting yourself up for the best success to avoid getting that illness. And if you are vaccinated post-exposure and it doesn't totally prevent you from getting monkeypox, what it may do is lessen the symptoms. So you may come out the other end of that a lot better off than if you hadn't gotten that vaccine after your exposure.
Great. Now, before we wrap up, I just want to make people aware of a few resources that are maybe more specific to New York City residents. But the first is nyc.gov/monkeypox, where you can go and read more about monkeypox and also make appointments for vaccinations as they become available. And you can also stay up to date by texting monkeypox to 692-692 or monkeypox ESP for Spanish to get text alerts about monkeypox updates and vaccination appointments as they become available here in New York City. Now, I would just want to thank you, Nurse Matt, for being here with us today and being a great source of knowledge on this topic.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Listen, you're my friend.
I noticed you haven't really been yourself recently.
Yeah, I feel like something's up.
How are you?
Are you okay?
Is there anything you want to talk about?
I just want to know how you're feeling.
And listen, even if you don't know what to say, I'm here to talk.
No matter what you're going through,
I just want you to know I'm here.
I've got your back. When you want to talk, I'm here.
Remember that you can stay up to date with all things Out Loud on our website, outloudtalk.com, and on social media on Facebook at OutLoudLGBT, on Instagram at OutLoud.tv, and on Twitter at OutLoudLGBTTV. And if you are an LGBTQ plus person or organization and would like to come on the show and share your story or the work that you're doing for the community, feel free to submit using the Be on the Show tab at the top of our website. And remember, being your true self is your greatest gift to the world. We'll see you next time here at Out Loud.